It was supposed to be an ordinary day, but for 9-year-old Emily, what began as a simple walk to the park turned into a nightmare no child should ever face. In the blink of an eye, her world was ripped apart, and she found herself trapped in a terrifying ordeal no one could have ever predicted. With every step, Emily was pulled deeper into the unknown, a predator's grip closing around her, leaving her with only one choice: escape or never see her family again. In the moments that followed, young Emily did something unbelievable to change her fate. You will never imagine what she did the moment she realized there was no one coming to save her. Emily had always been the kind of child who stood out, not for her appearance, but for the light she carried within. At just 9 years old, she was already a dreamer, full of wonder, full of curiosity. Every day was an adventure in her eyes. The small town she grew up in, nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside, was a quiet place where everyone knew each other's name. It was the kind of town where kids rode their bikes down the streets without a second thought, where parents left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. In many ways, it was the perfect place for a child to grow up, to feel safe, to feel invincible. Her home, though modest, was filled with love. Emily lived with her mother, Sarah, and her father, David. They weren't rich by any measure, far from it. Sarah worked long shifts at the local hospital, providing care for the elderly and the sick, while David spent his days in the grease and oil of his mechanic shop, repairing cars that had seen better days. Despite the hardships, they always found ways to make things work. They lived paycheck to paycheck, but Emily never noticed the struggles. She never knew how tight the money was or how much her parents sacrificed. To her, their love was enough. Their home was warm, their meals were filling, and their laughter was endless. The bond between Emily and her parents was unbreakable. They were a team, a small but mighty unit. Every day, her mother would remind her of how special she was, how she was the light of their lives. Sarah would say it with such conviction, with such love, that Emily never questioned it. She believed, with all her heart, that no matter what happened, she could face anything, because her parents were always there, her strength, her foundation. David, her father, was just as devoted. He wasn't the most expressive person, but when he looked at Emily, you could see it in his eyes. The pride, the fierce protection he felt for his little girl. There was a moment every evening, after dinner, when they'd sit together on the old porch swing. Emily would ask her father questions about his day, about the cars he worked on, and David would listen attentively, his rough hands gently brushing her hair as he answered her. It wasn't the conversation itself that mattered. It was the quiet moments of connection. Emily would smile and say, "I love you, Daddy," and David would pull her in close, saying, "I love you more than anything in this world, Em." Though life wasn't always easy, Emily never felt anything less than safe in her family's embrace. They made the best of everything. A warm dinner, even if it was something simple, an impromptu game of catch in the backyard when the weather was nice. Emily's world, small as it was, felt complete. It was the kind of world where dreams could grow, even if they seemed impossible. And Emily's dream, the one she clung to with unwavering determination, was to become a doctor. She saw her mother healing the sick, and she wanted to do the same, to make a difference, to give others the same hope that her mother had given to countless patients over the years. Her dream wasn't something born out of privilege. Emily knew what it meant to work hard for the things you wanted. Her parents didn't have the means to send her to expensive schools or private tutors, but they gave her something more important: encouragement. Every time Emily stumbled in school or felt discouraged, Sarah and David were right there to lift her up, to remind her that no dream was too big if you worked hard enough. It was a quiet, steady kind of happiness, a kind of life where each small victory, whether it was getting an A on a test or fixing the fence in the backyard, felt monumental. And despite the struggles they faced, despite the money worries and the long days of hard work, Emily never doubted that her family was rich in something far more valuable than wealth. She knew she was loved, truly loved, and that was enough to make her believe that anything was possible. One morning, Emily left her home to walk to the park, a place she'd been to 1,000 times before. But what she didn't know was that the world she trusted so deeply, the world she felt so safe in, was about to shatter in an instant. She had no way of knowing that the streets she walked every day, the ones she believed were so safe, would soon become the setting for the most terrifying moment of her life, a situation that no child should ever experience. And now, her once ordinary life was about to become a fight for survival. It was an ordinary morning, like any other. The sun was still low in the sky as Emily hurried down the front steps, her backpack bouncing with each step. Her mother, Sarah, kissed her on the cheek and told her to have a good day at the park, brushing a lock of Emily's hair from her face. "I love you, sweetheart," she said with a smile, never knowing that this would be the last time she would see her daughter for days. Emily smiled back, her heart light, unaware that the world she knew was about to shift forever. With a wave, Emily skipped down the sidewalk, heading toward the park where she often played with friends. The streets were quiet, the early morning air fresh with the scent of dew. It was the kind of peaceful morning where danger seemed unimaginable, as if everything was right in the world. But something was wrong. She just couldn't put her finger on it. As Emily approached the corner near the park, she noticed a man standing by the side of the road. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, and looked as though he was waiting for someone. When he turned and smiled at her, his expression was warm enough that Emily didn't think twice. It seemed harmless, just a man, maybe asking for directions or perhaps in need of help. But as he stepped forward and greeted her, a cold shiver ran down her spine. Something in his eyes, a flash of something unsettling, made her hesitate just for a moment. But it was too late. Before Emily could take a step back, the man's hand shot out, gripping her arm with a force she hadn't anticipated. "Come here," he said, his voice low but firm, pulling her toward a dark sedan parked nearby. Panic surged through her. Emily's heart raced, her breath caught in her throat. She tried to scream, but his hand was already over her mouth, muffling her cries. The man's grip was like iron, his breath foul against her cheek as he yanked her into the car. The car door slammed shut, the sound echoing in her ears like a death knell. As they sped away, Emily's thoughts were racing, too. She struggled against the man's hold, but his grip was unyielding. Her mind spun, her body frozen in terror. How could this be happening? Was this really happening? She thought of her mother, her father. Would they come for her? Would they even know where she was? A sinking feeling filled her chest. She had to get out. But how? The car turned onto a gravel road, and the scenery grew more desolate. The landscape around her was unfamiliar, the houses fewer and farther apart. She knew they were heading somewhere isolated, and dread pooled in her stomach. The man hadn't said a word since they left, his eyes fixed on the road, his jaw tight with concentration. The silence in the car was suffocating. Emily's fear began to swell like a tidal wave, but she refused to let herself fall apart. She forced herself to think back to everything her parents had ever taught her. Her mother's warnings about strangers, her father's lessons on trusting your instincts, even when you're scared. The words echoed in her mind. "Always listen to your gut, Emily. Don't go anywhere with anyone you don't know." Her mind raced as she tried to remember what she had been told in case something like this ever happened. But she wasn't prepared for this. How could anyone be? The car finally pulled up to a secluded house, isolated on the edge of a dense forest. The man's grip on her arm never loosened as he dragged her inside. The house smelled musty and old, and the dim light filtering through the dirty windows cast long shadows on the walls. Emily felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She had no idea where she was, or who this man was, but the desperation in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He was dangerous. Inside, the man shoved her into a small room and locked the door behind her. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall, and then silence. The kind of silence that made her feel completely and utterly alone. She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill. But crying wouldn't help her now. She had to focus. She had to survive. For a long time, she stayed still, listening carefully for any sign of movement outside the room. Slowly, her mind began to clear. Her mother's voice came back to her, calm and soothing, telling her to stay strong. "You're smarter than this," Emily whispered to herself. "You're not going to let him win." She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Remember what you've learned," she told herself. She could still get out of this. There had to be a way. But her thoughts were interrupted by a harsh knock on the door. The man's voice echoed from the other side. "Stay quiet," he warned. "If you make any noise, I'll make sure you regret it." The threat was clear. Emily's stomach twisted, but she knew that now wasn't the time to fight. Now was the time to plan. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could she overpower him? Could she find a way to escape without him noticing? Emily thought about the moments when she had been with her parents, how her father had always told her to trust her instincts, to keep her eyes open for any opportunity. She knew she couldn't give up. She had to stay calm, stay smart, and wait for her chance. But as the hours dragged on, the fear gnawed at her, and every noise outside the door sent her pulse racing. In that small, cold room, as the darkness closed in, Emily's only hope was that her family, her parents, would never stop looking for her. She clung to that thought like a lifeline. They would find her. They had to. For days, Emily had been trapped in a cold, dark house far from the world she knew, a place where the sound of her own heartbeat seemed deafening in the silence that surrounded her. The man who had taken her had kept her locked away, hiding her from the outside world as though she were nothing more than a secret he could control. Every day felt like an eternity, each hour stretching longer than the last. There was no comfort here, no kindness, no hope, only the heavy weight of fear that clung to her like a second skin. The house, isolated on the edge of a thick forest, was a prison. The walls were lined with old wallpaper that seemed to peel in places, like it too wanted to escape. There were no windows to see the outside world, just a small, dimly lit room where she was kept. And the man, his face, his voice, his presence, had become a constant reminder that no one knew where she was, that no one could help her. He watched her closely, always asking questions, always reminding her that she was his, and that if she tried to run, the consequences would be more than she could bear. But Emily had never been one to give up easily. The fierce love for her family, the lessons her parents had taught her, all the memories of better days, they fueled something inside her, a spark that refused to go out. Each day, she'd listened carefully, watching for any sign that the man might slip up, any opportunity she could use to escape. But days turned into weeks, and still she was trapped. It wasn't until one day, when the man left the room for just a few moments, that Emily saw it. It was a crack in the door, a small, unguarded opening that had been left by his carelessness. That tiny crack, that one small shift in his routine was all she needed to see. "This is my chance," she thought, heart racing as she felt the adrenaline surge through her. It was the moment she had been waiting for. Her breath caught in her throat as she considered the risks. She could hear the man's footsteps fading down the hallway, and with every step, the fear in her chest seemed to tighten. If she moved too soon, if she made a sound, he would catch her. And there was no telling what he might do. The thought of being dragged back into that house, of facing the terror that awaited her if she failed, threatened to paralyze her. But the reality was clear. She might not get another chance. She had to act now, or she might never see her family again. In that moment, the room seemed to shrink around her. All the fear, the pain, the hopelessness, it all melted away, leaving her with only one thought: I have to save myself. It was no longer about waiting for someone else to come to her rescue. It was about taking control of her own fate. Emily knew that if she didn't try now, she might never get the chance again. There was no hero coming. She was her own hero now. With trembling hands, she reached toward the door, her fingers brushing the cool wood. The crack in the door was wide enough to slip through, but she knew she couldn't afford to be careless. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as she carefully pushed the door open just enough to slip through. She held her breath, listening for any sound of the man returning. The silence was suffocating, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Every step she took was a calculated risk. She moved quickly, but quietly, her body trembling with fear as she crept through the dark, unfamiliar house. Each creak of the floorboards under her feet seemed to magnify in the silence, and every shadow cast by the moonlight outside seemed to loom larger than it should. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't turn back. With every step she took, the hope that she might make it to safety grew stronger. As she reached the back door, Emily's fingers brushed the cold metal handle, and she froze. For a moment, she hesitated. Could she really make it? Could she truly escape this nightmare and return to her family? The thought was almost too much to bear, but she didn't let herself dwell on it. She gripped the handle and turned it, slowly, carefully. The door creaked open. Her heart was racing now, faster than ever, and the world outside, the world she had almost forgotten, was right there in front of her. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emily stepped into the yard, the cool air filling her lungs as she took a shaky breath. But her fear wasn't over yet. The yard was still part of the prison, and if the man was still nearby, she knew it would be almost impossible to escape unnoticed. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the yard, and the ground was soft beneath her feet, the earth clinging to her shoes with every step. Emily's mind raced as she tried to think, to plan her next move. She could hear the sound of the wind rustling in the trees and the distant chirping of crickets, but there was no other noise. It was too quiet, too perfect, too terrifying. Every step she took felt like it could be her last. But with each step, the sense of freedom, the sense that she was fighting for her life, grew stronger. There was no turning back now. Emily knew that the moment she left that house, there would be no coming back to the safety of those walls. The world outside was unpredictable, unknown, but it was also the only chance she had. The moment had come. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of fear and determination. She knew this was it, her one chance to escape, to take the power back. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to move faster, to run, and for the first time since she was taken, she felt a glimmer of hope. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps, louder now, brought her to a halt. The man was coming back. She could hear him muttering to himself, his voice growing closer. Emily froze, barely breathing, barely moving. A few more steps, and he would be right there. She couldn't afford to be caught. She couldn't go back to that dark room, to the cold silence. Her heart thundered in her chest. If she was going to escape, it had to be now. Without thinking, she darted into the yard. Her legs moved faster than she ever thought possible, every instinct telling her to run as far and as fast as she could. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the forest looming just beyond the yard, a place she knew she needed to reach. She didn't dare look back, but the sound of the man's voice rang out through the trees. "You think you can escape? You better stop," he shouted, his voice twisted with rage. "Stop right now." But Emily didn't stop. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed her small body harder, her legs burning with the effort. She could hear his footsteps behind her, his breath growing louder. She knew he was close. She could feel it. The terror clawed at her throat, but she didn't let it overtake her. She couldn't. Not now. Not when she was so close. The trees started to thin out in front of her, and through the branches, she saw it. A road. A real road, a place where people passed by, a place where she could finally be seen. Her heart skipped. A car. A car was coming. "Please, please, please," Emily whispered to herself, her body shaking as she ran with everything she had left. She burst into the clearing, her eyes fixed on the car now drawing nearer. She could hear the tires crunching against the gravel. She was so close, her legs aching, her chest on fire, but she couldn't stop. Not now. As the car came into view, Emily flung herself into the road, waving her arms frantically. She didn't care who it was. She didn't care what they thought. All that mattered was that anyone, stop. Please, she screamed, her voice hoarse with fear. Help me. I've been kidnapped. Her words tumbled out in a rush, her voice raw and desperate. She didn't even know if they could hear her over the sound of her own screams. But she didn't stop. The car screeched to a halt, the driver slamming on the brakes as they took in the sight of the frightened little girl standing in the middle of the road, covered in dirt, her clothes torn, her face streaked with tears. Without hesitation, the driver threw open the door and reached for her. Get in, honey, they said, their voice calm but urgent. We're going to get you help. The driver pulled out his phone and immediately called 911, speaking quickly but clearly, giving them the location. Emily climbed into the car, shaking uncontrollably, her body racked with sobs. She couldn't believe it. She was finally free. She was finally safe. But as the car sped off, heading toward the nearest town, Emily's mind raced with one thought. She had made it. She had fought and she had won. But she wasn't free yet. Not completely. She still had to face what had happened. Still had to face the fear that had haunted her. And most importantly, she still had to go home. To her parents. To the people who loved her. Back at her home, Sarah and David had no idea that their daughter was closer than they could ever imagine. When the phone rang, they thought it was just another one of the countless calls they'd made to hospitals, to the police, to any authority that might have answers. But this time, it wasn't just a call. It was the news they'd been praying for. Their daughter was alive. She was safe. The relief that washed over them was overwhelming, as if all the air had been sucked from the room. They could barely process it at first. Couldn't understand that the nightmare was finally over. Sarah collapsed into David's arms, tears streaming down her face as the joy broke through all the months of fear and uncertainty. She was alive. Emily was coming home. When the car pulled up to the house, Emily was barely able to stand as she stepped out, her legs weak, her feet stumbling as she walked toward the front door. And then, from the doorway, she saw them, her parents, standing together, their faces a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy. She ran toward them, and they wrapped her in their arms, holding her so tightly that she could hardly breathe. The world around them seemed to fade away. All that mattered was that they were together again. Her mother, shaking with emotion, whispered through her tears, "I love you. I love you so much, baby." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily allowed herself to believe it. She was home. She was safe. The days after Emily's escape were a whirlwind, a blur of police interviews, statements, and questions she wasn't ready to answer. But amidst it all, there was one undeniable truth. She was alive, safe. Yet even that could not erase the horrors she had faced. The trauma of those days, the fear, the confusion, the uncertainty, lingered in her mind like a dark cloud. Though physically unharmed, Emily's heart was broken in ways no one could see. In the days that followed her rescue, Emily found herself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing with the echoes of those terrible hours. She couldn't shake the images of the man's face, the sound of his footsteps, the feeling of being trapped. She would close her eyes and try to forget, but the memories clung to her like a shadow that followed her everywhere she went. Her parents, too, were grappling with their own pain. They had spent days in agony, not knowing where their daughter was, not knowing if she was alive or dead. But when she returned, their relief was quickly overshadowed by a deep sorrow. Emily was back, but she was different. Her once bright eyes were now clouded with the weight of what she had endured. Her laughter, once so innocent, was replaced by long silences. Sarah and David tried their best to give her the space she needed, but the house felt different now. It was no longer a place of safety and comfort. It felt too small, too quiet, too full of reminders of what had happened. They would sit together at the dinner table, but the conversations felt awkward, as though they were all still strangers to one another, unsure of how to rebuild what had been broken. Sarah, ever the protector, found herself watching Emily closely, her eyes constantly scanning her daughter's face for signs of distress. afraid to miss any sign that her little girl wasn't truly okay. David, the stoic father, was no better. Though he tried to hide it, his pain was evident every time he looked at Emily. His strong arms, once so sure and steady, trembled when he hugged her. He held back tears whenever he saw her sitting quietly in the corner, her gaze distant, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. For the first time, he felt completely helpless. How could I have let this happen? He would ask himself in the stillness of the night, guilt gnawing at his insides. The man who had always prided himself on being strong, on being the protector, now felt vulnerable, exposed. They had to adjust to a new kind of normal. Emily was enrolled in therapy, though it took her weeks to even be able to speak about the kidnapping. Each session felt like a battle for her, as though telling the story would mean reliving it all over again. But slowly, with time, she began to open up. She began to tell the therapist about the man's face, the way he'd smelled, the coldness in his eyes. And each word, though painful, was a step toward healing. It was a long road. Some days were better than others. Emily had moments where she smiled again, moments where she laughed with her parents, where they could pretend, if only for a few minutes, that things were back to how they used to be. But there were also days where the sadness would return, where she would retreat into herself and refuse to speak. But her parents, though they didn't have all the answers, knew they couldn't give up on her. They knew that healing wasn't linear, and that the road to recovery was full of twists and turns. But they also knew that they would walk beside her every step of the way. And so they did. They learned to live with the weight of the trauma, to find new ways to support Emily. David, who had always been so focused on being the strong one, now realized that being strong didn't mean pretending the pain didn't exist. It meant facing it together. Sarah, too, found herself redefined by this experience. No longer just a mother who protected her child from the outside world, she became a mother who helped her daughter heal from the inside. And Emily, though she would never be the same little girl she once was, began to learn that strength didn't mean forgetting what had happened. It meant surviving. It meant continuing to move forward, no matter how heavy the burden. The journey was far from over. There were still scars, still moments where the memories would surface like unwanted guests. But together, they faced those moments as a family. Together, they healed. The years that followed were a slow but steady climb for Emily. The trauma of her ordeal never completely vanished, but with time, she found a way to breathe again. At first, it was the smallest victories. Getting out of bed, walking outside without looking over her shoulder, speaking to someone without the weight of fear pulling her down. She would wake up each day knowing that healing wasn't a straight path, but with each step, she grew stronger. And then, something remarkable began to happen. Emily found her voice, no longer a frightened child, but a young woman with a purpose. She began to speak out, sharing her story not to relive the nightmare, but to help others. She became an advocate for children's safety, traveling across the country to raise awareness about child abduction and the importance of protection and prevention. She worked with organizations, speaking to groups of children, parents, and even law enforcement, urging them to take action before it's too late. Her story, once one of horror, had now become one of hope. Hope for the children who might be too afraid to speak, for the parents who might feel powerless in the face of such fear. Emily knew that if her experience could prevent even one child from suffering the way she had, then it would all be worth it. Emily's journey was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She was just a child when the unimaginable happened, but she fought with every ounce of strength she had to reclaim her life. Her story wasn't just about survival. It was about the will to rise above, to turn darkness into light, and to never stop fighting for a future filled with possibilities. Today, as she stands before a room full of strangers, her voice steady and strong, Emily reflects on everything she's overcome. She knows the road ahead may still be difficult, but the girl who once ran from a nightmare has become the woman who inspires hope. Her message is simple, but powerful. You are not alone. You have the strength to survive, and you have the power to create change. And as the audience listens, captivated by her story, there's no question in anyone's mind. Emily's voice, once silenced by fear, is now louder than ever, echoing through the hearts of all who hear her. A reminder that survival is not just about escaping the darkness, but about using your strength to light the way for others. This is Emily's legacy, a story of survival, of unbreakable strength, and of the hope that one person's journey can change the world for the better. As we close today's story, we want to hear from you. Emily's journey is a reminder of the incredible strength we all possess, even in the darkest moments. But we also need to ask, how would you react in a situation like hers? How would you find the courage to face the unthinkable and fight for your freedom? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your perspective could inspire others who may be going through their own battles. If you found Emily's story as moving as we did, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a powerful story like this one. We bring you real, emotional stories that remind us of the resilience and strength of the human spirit. Thank you for watching Soulful Twists, and we'll see you in the next chapter of incredible survival, strength, and hope.